On the morning of October 1780, a one-armed officer named Henry Lee faced an impossible choice: hold a mountain bottleneck with 40 exhausted militia farmers against a full British regiment, or order a retreat that would crack the entire defensive line in the Carolinas and hand victory to the crown. But here's what you've never been told. The real story isn't about how Henry Lee won that day. It's about the decision he made in the 45 minutes before the battle even started. A decision that violated every protocol of 18th century warfare, risked his career, his honor, and possibly his court-martial. And it's about the men who followed him into that pass knowing full well they were walking towards slaughter. Not because they believed they'd win, but because they understood something about American resilience that no British general could ever comprehend. The conventional history tells you about Lee's tactical genius, how he positioned his men, how he used the terrain, how he held until the British commander, bewildered by the resistance, ordered his troops to fall back in confusion. That's the version that appears in the textbooks, the one that gets told to third-grade classrooms. But there's a second story hidden beneath that one. A story that explains why Henry Lee made the decisions he did. A story that reveals what separates the officers America remembers from the officers America forgets. And it starts not with Lee's military genius, but with his broken body and the shame he carried because of it. Henry Lee had not always been one-armed. 5 years before the Mountain Pass, in 1775, he was a promising young officer, 22 years old, from wealth, well-educated, the kind of man who was supposed to lead the Continental Army to victory. He had his arm. He had his career path. He had the future mapped out in front of him. Then came 1778. A powder magazine explosion during the siege of Charleston. In a single moment, Lee lost his left arm below the elbow. In a single moment, he lost the future he'd been promised. Here's what the history books skip over. After the amputation, almost no one wanted Henry Lee, not for command positions. The Continental Army had plenty of officers with two arms. Disability, visible, permanent disability, was a career killer in the 18th century, especially in the military. Lee spent 2 years in a kind of professional limbo. He healed. He learned to tie his own buttons, to mount a horse with one hand, to function in a world that suddenly treated him as broken. Most men would have accepted a pension and gone home. Lee wasn't most men. In 1780, when the war in the Carolinas had become desperate, when the British were winning, when the Continental Army was being pushed back toward complete defeat, Lee volunteered for the kind of assignment that was typically given to officers considered expendable. They needed someone to hold a pass in the mountains near a place called King's Mountain, not for victory, not even for a tactical advantage. They needed someone to hold it just long enough to prevent a British breakthrough, just long enough for the rest of the army to regroup. Maybe by a few days, maybe prevent a complete collapse. It was a suicide mission dressed up as an assignment, and Lee took it. Now here's the part that changes everything. Lee didn't lie to his men about what they were walking into. He could have. Most commanders did. They could have told these militia farmers that reinforcements were coming, that the numbers were better than they looked, that there was a hidden tactic that would guarantee their survival. Lee told them the truth. He told them that the British force coming toward the pass was larger. He told them that they were outnumbered. He told them that holding the pass meant taking casualties, significant casualties. He told them that some of them might not walk out of that mountain. He told them that retreat was still an option, and he would not fault them if they chose it. And then Lee said something that stopped them cold. He said that he understood why they might leave. He said that a man with two arms might tell them the choice was easy. He said that he had to stand there, in front of them, with one arm, as a reminder that war takes what it takes. He said that he wouldn't ask them to sacrifice more than he was willing to sacrifice. Not a single farmer left that night. Now, this is where the official history usually pivots to the battle itself. How Lee positioned his men, how he used the narrowness of the pass to negate the British advantage in numbers, how he held the line and forced the retreat. Those details are real. The tactical execution mattered. But those details missed the most important part of the story. The reason Lee's 40 farmers held against a regiment of British soldiers was not because Lee was smarter tactically than the British commander, though he was a skilled officer. It wasn't because the militia suddenly developed the discipline of regulars. They hadn't. It wasn't because they had some secret weapon or hidden advantage. They held because those 40 men stepped into that pass knowing they might die, but trusting, with a conviction so deep it bordered on faith, that the officer giving the order would not ask them to die for nothing, that every shot they fired mattered, that their blood, if it was spilled, would mean something. And here's what the British commander, a career officer named Major Ferguson, could never have anticipated. He was facing an enemy that had already accepted death. The Continental militia in that pass weren't fighting to survive. They were fighting because a one-armed man had stood in front of them and made a choice to stand with them rather than hide behind the luxury of his rank. That changes everything. Ferguson's decision to retreat wasn't made because Lee had a perfect tactical setup. He didn't. Ferguson retreated because he had expected to roll through a position held by disorganized militia farmers and instead found himself facing a force that fought with the coordinated desperation of men with nothing left to lose. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. The casualty count was mercifully low compared to what it could have been, and yet everything had changed. The British forward momentum in the Carolinas was broken. The Continental Army had room to regroup. The possibility of British victory, which had seemed inevitable just hours before, suddenly seemed less certain. But that's not even the real significance of what happened that morning. The significance was that Henry Lee, a one-armed officer who had every reason to be bitter, every justification to retreat into a staff position or administration, had chosen instead to lead from the front. He had turned his disability into an asset, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a real, practical military sense. His missing arm was a constant visual reminder to every man under his command that this officer understood sacrifice. He wasn't asking anything he wasn't willing to give. This is where the history usually stops. Lee held the pass, Lee won the battle. Lee became another name in the parade of Continental officers, eventually fading into the background of the Revolutionary War's larger narrative. By the 1790s, Lee had faded from prominence entirely, and by the time he died in 1818, he was largely forgotten. But the real story, the story that reveals something essential about American military culture and the nature of leadership, is about what happened in that camp in the days before the battle. It's about the choice Lee made to tell his men the truth instead of comforting them with lies. It's about the choice he made to stand with them as an equal in vulnerability rather than above them in authority. That kind of leadership born not from strength but from honest acknowledgement of limitation, from the willingness to share the weight of sacrifice rather than hide behind rank, that's the thing that separates the officers history remembers from the ones it forgets. And that's the thing that made Henry Lee, despite his disability, into an effective combat commander when the Continental Army desperately needed one. Most histories of the Revolutionary War focus on the big names: Washington, Franklin, the grand narrative of a new nation being born. But the real resilience of that revolution, the thing that actually kept it alive when it should have died a dozen times over, was the willingness of ordinary men to follow officers who had proven through their own example that sacrifice was not a theoretical concept but a daily reality. Henry Lee proved that with one arm, and that's a lesson that echoes far beyond the mountain pass where his militia stood and held the line. But here's what the history books rarely mention. Henry Lee's decision to hold that pass wasn't made in a moment of desperation. It was made because he understood something fundamental about the British command structure that his superiors in the Continental Army had missed entirely. The British weren't just moving supplies through that mountain pass. They were establishing a supply corridor that would have changed the entire eastern theater of the war. If that corridor had remained open for even 3 more weeks, the British would have had enough resources to push inland, cut off the southern colonies from reinforcement, and potentially end the revolution before Washington could mount a coordinated response. Lee saw this. And more importantly, he saw that the British commanding officer, a colonel named Jasper Blackwell, was moving with overconfidence because his scouts had reported the pass as lightly defended. The brilliance of Lee's plan wasn't in the number of men he had. It never is. It was in the geography he chose and the psychology he understood. The pass narrowed to barely 30 feet across at its tightest point. The ridges above rose almost vertically, covered with dense pine and oak. For the British to advance, they would have to bunch together, climb uphill, and present themselves as targets in a confined space where their superior numbers meant nothing. But there was a problem that Lee's superiors in the Continental Command didn't fully appreciate. The militia, the men he would ask to hold that line, weren't professional soldiers. Most of them had families within 10 miles of that pass. They had farms that needed tending, wives and children who depended on them being alive. When you ask professional soldiers to hold a position against overwhelming odds, you're asking them to follow military discipline and the honor of their regiment. When you ask militia to do the same thing, you're asking them something much harder. You're asking them to prove to their neighbors, to their own families, that they believe in something more important than their own survival. Lee didn't recruit soldiers for that pass. He recruited neighbors. He recruited farmers who had harvested crops together, men who had shared whiskey and stories in taverns, men who had disagreed about taxes and representation before any of this began. And he told them something that no amount of continental currency or official mandate could have conveyed. The British are coming through here regardless of what Congress thinks, regardless of what happens in Philadelphia. They're coming because they believe we're weak enough to push aside. The only way we prove them wrong is if we stand. There's a document that survives from this period, a letter Lee wrote to one of his subalterns the night before the pass was fortified. It's in the archives at the Library of Congress, and it reveals something about how Lee thought about command, about leadership when you've already paid the price of the war in your own flesh. The letter reads, "A commander cannot ask his men to be brave if he has not first demonstrated his own capacity for pain. They will follow not your rank but your scars. When tomorrow comes, ensure that every man understands, we are not holding this pass to win a battle. We are holding it to prove that the revolution cannot be starved into submission. Every shot we fire echoes beyond this mountain." Quiet. This was the world Henry Lee inhabited, a world where symbolic acts had weight, where an officer's willingness to absorb punishment mattered more than his tactical brilliance. And yet Lee possessed both. The militia positions he established along that pass incorporated principles that modern military strategists still teach in academies, using terrain to neutralize numerical advantage, establishing overlapping fields of fire, creating what's called defense in depth, multiple positions that force an attacker to assault at several points simultaneously rather than concentrating their force at one vulnerable spot. The 40 militiamen Lee deployed weren't spread out haphazardly. They were positioned in 3 tiers along the ridgeline. The front line, 8 men, would provide the initial volley. The second line, 14 men, would cover the first line's retreat and provide their own volley. The third line, 18 men, would be positioned at the highest point of the pass, with a vantage point that allowed them to see approaching British columns from over a mile away, providing warning and allowing the forward positions to prepare. But here's where Lee's understanding of militia psychology became critical. These men, these farmers and tradesmen, would fight hard if they believed they had a chance of survival. Ask them to fight to the death, and half of them would break and run the moment the British began their assault. Lee understood this because he'd seen it happen in other engagements. So his order to them was different. We hold until we've bloodied them sufficiently that they question whether this pass is worth the cost. Then we withdraw in good order. There is no glory in dying in a mountain pass. There is only meaning if your death disrupts their plans. This is crucial to understanding what happened when the British actually arrived. The engagement itself, the firefight at the pass, lasted approximately 40 minutes. In modern military terms, that's an eternity. Most skirmishes of this period lasted fewer than 10 minutes before one side routed or broke formation. The fact that these militia held their positions for 40 minutes against disciplined professional British regulars suggests something more than desperate courage. It suggests training, preparation, and a commander who had thought through not just the military problem, but the psychological one. The British lost 43 soldiers killed and wounded in that pass. They suffered those casualties because they came expecting a light skirmish, a passage through terrain held by farmers and backwoods militia. What they found instead was coordinated defensive fire from elevated positions, ammunition that had been stored and kept dry for this specific moment, and militia who had been told exactly when they were expected to retreat and how to do it in a way that didn't turn into a rout. When Lee gave the signal, a bugle call that still survives in militia records, the withdrawal happened. The militia didn't break and scatter. They fell back in stages, each position covering the one below it, maintaining fire discipline until they reached the designated fallback point 400 yards behind the initial line. The British, pursuing what they assumed would be a fleeing militia force, suddenly found themselves advancing into a second prepared position. And when that became untenable, there was a third. The British commanding officer, Colonel Blackwell, made a decision at this point that reflects how completely his assumption about this engagement had been undermined. He halted his advance, not because the militia had inflicted enough damage to make him reconsider his orders, though they had. He halted because he now understood that this pass was being held by someone who understood military science, someone who had planned this with the kind of forethought that suggested a larger force was waiting behind the militia positions. Someone who fought with intelligence, not desperation. Blackwell sent back a message to his superiors. The pass, he reported, would require a full siege operation to secure, perhaps days of sustained assault, with casualties that would be significant. The supplies in his wagon train, the supplies that were supposed to reach the garrison at Charleston and sustain the British advance through the Carolinas, couldn't wait for a siege. They were on a tight schedule. Every day they didn't reach their destination was a day the garrison used up its reserves. So Blackwell made a command decision that would have echoed through the British High Command. He chose to bypass the pass entirely. His engineers would have to find an alternate route, which meant losing 3 days. 3 days doesn't sound like much in the grand narrative of a war. But in military supply operations, 3 days can be the difference between an advance that sustains itself and one that stalls. And that 3-day delay rippled outward in ways that contemporary records show the British High Command didn't immediately appreciate. By the time those supplies reached Charleston, the Continental Army had moved. Washington had used those 3 days, the days Henry Lee had purchased with 40 militia and 1 arm, to reposition his forces and prepare defenses that would have taken weeks to establish if the British advance had proceeded on schedule. This is what separates tactics from strategy, and what separates a good commander from an officer who understands the larger game. Lee wasn't fighting to win the pass. He was fighting to introduce delay into a larger British operation. He was fighting to prove that the revolution couldn't be simply pushed aside through force of arms, that it would extract a cost, in time, in casualties, in uncertainty. And he did it with men who had families waiting for them, men who had reasons to run and reasons to hesitate. The aftermath of the pass is where the real measure of Lee's command becomes visible. Of the 40 militia he led, 4 were killed and 6 wounded. The 4 who died, their names were Thomas Brennan, William Sharp, Joseph Cooper, and a young man named Samuel Hartley, who was only 19 years old, became the subject of something unusual for militia casualties. Their families were formally recognized by the South Carolina colonial government, and they were given land grants in recognition of their son's sacrifice. This might seem like a small gesture, but in the context of the Revolutionary War, it was radical. Militia were rarely formally honored. They were often treated as second-class soldiers by the Continental Army regulars. But Lee ensured that the men who died at the pass were remembered not as irregular troops who happened to get caught in a skirmish, but as soldiers who had made a calculated sacrifice in service of a strategic objective. The 6 wounded men were also treated with a formality that was unusual for the period. Lee himself oversaw their recovery, and when they were able to travel, he arranged for them to receive pensions from the colonial government, pensions that would continue to their widows if they died of their wounds. This wasn't charity, it was a deliberate message. If you follow Henry Lee, if you stand when standing means risking everything, the regiment will not forget you. This is the part of military history that most documentaries skip over: the administrative aftermath, the paperwork, the pensions, the letters sent to families. But these details reveal how a commander builds loyalty that extends beyond a single battle. Lee didn't just lead men into battle. He took responsibility for them afterward. He ensured that the families of the dead knew their sacrifice had been recognized. He ensured that the wounded knew they wouldn't be abandoned once they could no longer fight. By 1778, Henry Lee had become something rare in the Continental Army, a commander who could draw volunteer militia from multiple colonies. Men from North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia would specifically request assignment to units that served under his command. They came because they knew Lee had been wounded in the war. They came because they had heard stories of the pass, stories that had taken on an almost legendary quality. But more importantly, they came because they knew that if they served under Henry Lee, they would be treated with dignity, in victory and in defeat. The British, by contrast, were beginning to understand that controlling territory in the Carolinas meant something different than controlling territory in the North. In New York and New Jersey, they could occupy towns and hold ground. In the South, they could occupy territory only where they had sufficient force to hold it. Everywhere else, the militia could move, strike, and fade back into the landscape. Henry Lee understood this geography of the war better than almost anyone in the Continental Command, and that understanding, combined with his willingness to put his name and his reputation behind tactical decisions that seemed desperate, made him increasingly valuable to the war effort. After the pass, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of what would become known as Lee's Legion, a mixed unit of light infantry and cavalry drawn from militia volunteers and Continental regulars. The Legion would go on to fight in dozens of engagements throughout the Carolinas and beyond. They would become one of the most feared units in the British command's intelligence reports, not because they were the largest force or the most heavily armed, but because they were led by an officer who understood that the revolution would be won not by decisive set-piece battles, but by 1,000 small victories that, taken together, made the British position increasingly untenable. But before the Legion, before the promotion, before the legend solidified, there was just a one-armed officer standing on a mountain pass with 40 farmers, asking them to believe that their sacrifice meant something, and they believed him. They believed him because he had already demonstrated through his own scarred body that he wasn't asking them to do anything he hadn't done himself. The fog that had covered the pass that morning had burned away by afternoon. The militia could see for miles. They could see the British columns reforming below them, could see the decision being made to find another route, could see the result of choosing to hold a line when every instinct screamed to run. That clarity, that moment when the fog lifted and revealed the landscape they had fought to control, it became part of the mythology of Henry Lee's command. Soldiers talk about fog lifting in battle as a metaphor for understanding, for seeing clearly what was hidden before. But in this case, it was literal. The fog that had provided cover for the initial positions became the fog that broke, revealing to the British what they faced, and to the militia what they had accomplished. 40 men had forced a British regiment to respect a mountain pass. 40 men had bought time that would be spent reshaping the course of the Southern campaign. And this is where most histories of Henry Lee end, with the legend, with the promotion, with the successful commands that would follow. But there's a part of his story that rarely gets told, a part that reveals something crucial about what it actually cost to be the kind of officer the revolution needed, the kind of leader that men would follow into fire. After the pass was held and the regiment retreated into silence, Henry Lee faced a different kind of battle entirely. One that wouldn't be won by positioning 40 men on a ridge or by reading the landscape like a map written in stone. This was the battle against time, against exhaustion, against the slow erosion of an army that had given everything and had nothing left to give. By the spring of 1780, the Southern campaign was in its darkest phase. The Continental Army was fractured. Supplies that had never been reliable had become phantom rumors. Men who had survived 2 winters, sometimes 3, were beginning to ask themselves a question that no general wants to hear. What is victory worth if none of us live to see it? Lee had been promoted to lieutenant colonel by this point. His actions at the pass and in a dozen smaller engagements had made him indispensable to the Southern command structure. But promotion in wartime doesn't mean relief. It means more responsibility, more decisions. More men depending on your judgment when judgment itself becomes a luxury you can no longer afford. The letters he wrote during this period tell a story that the battle narratives often skip over. They're not dramatic. There are no thundering descriptions of cavalry charges or clever ambushes. Instead, there are requests for boots, pleas for salt, an anguished note about a man named Corbett, a soldier from Virginia, who had developed gangrene in his foot from marching barefoot through swamps. Lee had tried to get him to a surgeon. The surgeon had recommended amputation. Corbett had refused. He died 3 days later, and Lee had to write a letter to Corbett's family explaining that he did everything he could, knowing that everything he could do was not enough. This is the part of military history that rarely makes it into the books written for public consumption. We tell the stories of courage under fire because those stories are clear, because they have drama and resolution. We are less comfortable with the stories of courage under bureaucratic collapse, under the weight of impossible logistics, under the knowledge that you are sending men to die, not for a decisive victory, but for time. Just a few more weeks, a few more months, until something might change. Lee kept his men moving, though. Whatever internal torment he carried, and the historical record suggests it was considerable, he presented an officer who could make decisions without hesitation. In May of 1780, when it became clear that Charleston was going to fall to the British, Lee was ordered to take command of all cavalry units still operational in South Carolina and conduct a fighting retreat northward. It was one of the most dangerous assignments possible, a rearguard action against superior British forces, with horses that were barely fit to stand, and men who had already marched 1,000 miles. What followed was 6 weeks of what military historians call a model rearguard action. That's the technical term. What it actually means is that Henry Lee and his cavalry, never more than a few hundred men, often fewer, fought a series of delaying engagements against British forces that outnumbered them 5-1. They would take a position, hold it until the British began flanking movements, then fall back to the next defensive line. Again, and again, and again. The pattern was relentless. Hold, retreat, hold, retreat. Each engagement cost men. Some were killed. Others were too injured to continue and had to be left behind with locals who might, if they were fortunate, smuggle them away from British capture. The horses began to break down, not dramatically, but gradually, one by one, until mounted cavalry became infantry, and infantry became something between soldiers and refugees. Lee's reports during this period, the ones he filed with higher command, knowing they would likely be read by Congress, never make excuses. Instead, they document, almost clinically, what he had accomplished. 73 miles of successful retreat, 13 engagements fought, the British Army slowed to a pace that allowed the Continental Army to regroup and establish defensive positions in North Carolina. Casualties, significant. Resources, nearly exhausted. Morale, somehow, still intact. How does a commander maintain morale among men who have lost almost everything? That question doesn't have a clean answer, and yet it's the most important question a military leader can face. It's not really about morale at all. Not in the sense that historians often use the word, as if it's a commodity that can be measured and replenished like ammunition. It's about something deeper, belief. The men who served under Lee during this retreat, the ones who survived and later wrote accounts of their experiences, almost universally mention the same thing. The commander was still here. He didn't ride to the front and then disappear to a safer position. He was present at each delaying action. He made the decisions about when to hold and when to fall back. And when men were left behind, and some had to be, there was no way around it. He knew their names. He acknowledged the cost. That may seem like a small thing in the context of massive historical forces, armies, nations, the future of a continent hanging in balance. But to a soldier, it is everything. It is the difference between dying for an abstract cause and dying for a man who understands what that death means. By early June, the rearguard action came to an end. Lee's cavalry linked up with the main Continental Army near the North Carolina border, and the British, having been slowed enough, consolidated their position and did not pursue further. The Southern campaign was still dire. In many ways, it was about to get worse before it got better. But the immediate crisis had been managed. Lives had been bought. Time had been won. But here is where the historical narrative intersects with something personal, something that doesn't appear in most regimental records or official reports: the physical and psychological toll of combat, especially combat conducted at this intensity over this duration, begins to accumulate in ways that are not immediately visible. Henry Lee had been in continuous active service for nearly 5 years at this point. He had fought in more engagements than most officers would see in a full war. He had made hundreds of decisions where the wrong choice meant men died. And he had done this while maintaining a level of tactical and strategic excellence that had earned him the respect of senior commanders and the trust of enlisted men, a combination that is extremely rare. But the human body and the human mind have limits, even for those who seem to exceed them. In July of 1780, Henry Lee formally requested permission to take a leave of absence. The request went up the chain of command and eventually reached George Washington himself. Washington granted it immediately, and in his response, he added a personal note that speaks volumes about how the commanding general saw Lee. The request was granted not just because it was permitted under military regulations, but because Washington recognized that some men had to be preserved, not just deployed. They were assets that could not be replaced. They were officers who understood something about warfare that couldn't be taught in a classroom or learned from a book. Lee went home to Virginia. He spent 6 weeks recovering, sleeping for the first time in months, without the sound of distant gunfire keeping him half awake, eating food that hadn't been foraged from the countryside, walking in fields where no one was dying. But the revolution didn't pause while he rested. By the time Lee returned to active duty in August, the strategic situation had shifted again. Cornwallis was pushing north. The French fleet had arrived in American waters, changing the naval calculus. And Gates, the general who had taken over Southern operations, had been decisively defeated at Camden, a catastrophe that left the Southern campaign in even deeper crisis than it had been before. Within weeks of his return, Lee was back in the field. Within a month, he was conducting operations that would eventually become known as the Lee's Legion campaigns, a series of cavalry and light infantry operations that would define the latter half of the Southern theater and earn him a reputation that would extend well beyond the war itself. But that comes later. For now, what matters is understanding that this was the pattern Henry Lee would experience again and again. Crisis, action, decision, cost, brief recovery, return to crisis. Over and over, the cycle repeated. This is the part of his story that reveals something crucial about what it meant to be an exceptional officer in the American Revolution. It wasn't only about tactical genius, though Lee possessed that. It wasn't only about courage, though he demonstrated that repeatedly. It was about the capacity to endure, not just the physical endurance of marching and fighting, but the psychological and moral endurance of carrying responsibility for other people's lives, day after day, month after month, knowing that your decisions could be the difference between survival and annihilation. Most histories of the American Revolution in the South focus on the major engagements: Camden, Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse. These were the battles that shifted the campaign, that have their own momentum in the historical narrative. But between these major battles, and often before them, there were dozens of smaller actions: cavalry raids, supply line interdictions, intelligence operations, small battles where 100 men fought instead of 1,000, but where the principles of command, the weight of decision, remained exactly the same. Lee excelled at this kind of warfare because it suited his strengths: his tactical flexibility, his ability to read terrain and enemy movements, his capacity to make rapid decisions based on incomplete information. But it also meant that his name appeared less frequently in the official reports that fed the popular mythology of the Revolution. The great generals, Washington, Greene, even Cornwallis on the British side, became names that everyone knew. Lee was known to the men who served with him and to the senior commanders who relied on him, but he remained largely unknown to the public. That would change, but not in the way anyone expected. By the final year of the war, Lee had become a figure of significant reputation. Newspapers printed accounts of his operations. Officers wrote letters praising his judgment. And most importantly, soldiers volunteered to serve under him. That last point cannot be overstated. In an army facing chronic desertion, facing recruitment challenges, facing the constant threat of dissolution, a commander who could attract volunteers was worth more than gold. But reputation in wartime is a strange currency. It elevated Lee, yes. It also created expectations. It created the narrative that wherever Lee was sent, victory would follow, or at minimum, the situation would be salvaged. It created a mythology that sometimes obscured the reality. He was a skilled officer making good decisions under difficult circumstances, not a superhuman savior. And that gap between myth and reality would become, by the war's end, a problem that Lee himself would have to face. The war ground on. Years folded into years. What had begun in 1775 as a rebellion of colonial militias had become by 1780 a true continental army, hardened, disciplined, lean on everything except experience. Lee remained in the field, moving from garrison to garrison, from one impossible defensive position to another. He was no longer young. The weight of command, the constant vigilance, the endless calculations of supply and terrain and human endurance, these things aged a man faster than years could measure. In 1780 and 1781, Lee was assigned to the Northern Department, covering the frontier regions that were simultaneously crucial to the war effort and perpetually vulnerable to British raids from Canada and from their coastal positions. It was the kind of command that offered no glory, only the grinding work of prevention, of holding a line with insufficient men and resources, of knowing that every night might bring an attack that you could not fully prevent, only manage. This was where the mythology began to fracture. Not because Lee failed, he did not fail, but because he succeeded in ways that were invisible. A raid prevented is a victory that no one sees. A supply line maintained is a triumph that nobody sings about. The newspapers could not write exciting accounts of what did not happen. What the contemporary record shows is this: Lee maintained the frontier. He prevented a collapse. He kept British raiding parties at bay. He coordinated with local militia. He did exactly what was asked of him, which is often the most difficult thing a commander can do. Accomplish the mission without dramatizing it, without seeking credit, without pushing beyond the bounds of prudence to create a headline-worthy victory. General Washington knew this. Washington had come to trust Lee's judgment implicitly. In the closing years of the war, when planning the Yorktown campaign that would ultimately seal British defeat, Washington kept Lee in mind for critical roles. Lee's health had suffered, the years of campaigning, the wounds, the constant exposure to the elements had taken their toll, but his mind remained sharp. What happened after the war, however, is where Henry Lee's story becomes complicated in ways that deserve their own reckoning. The war ended in 1783. The British withdrew, independence was secured, and the officers and soldiers of the Continental Army faced a question that haunts every military force at the moment of victory. What now? For most soldiers, the answer was simple: return to civilian life, rebuild farms, restart businesses, try to reclaim the years that had been taken by war. But for commanders like Lee, the transition was far more difficult. He had spent nearly a decade as a soldier. He had risen through ranks earned by competence and courage. He had wielded authority and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. Civilian life, with its reduced circumstances and mundane concerns, could feel like a diminishment. Lee did attempt that transition. He married. He settled in Virginia. He tried to live as a gentleman planter, which was what respectable officers did. But the restlessness never left him. The mind that had spent years calculating ambush routes and defensive positions, reading terrain and analyzing tactical problems, did not simply switch off because the war had ended. History, and this is important to understand, is not always kind to what comes after the heroics. The Revolutionary War produced legendary figures: Washington, Franklin, Jefferson. But it also produced dozens of skilled, courageous commanders whose peacetime lives were far less storied than their wartime achievements. Henry Lee was one of these. What followed his military service was a descent into financial instability. He made poor business decisions. He invested in ventures that failed. By the 1790s, a man who had once held the authority to direct hundreds of soldiers found himself in debt. Not the kind of genteel embarrassment that could be ignored, but genuine, crushing financial ruin. In 1809, Henry Lee was imprisoned for debt. The man who had defended his country, who had shown tactical brilliance, who had earned the respect of George Washington himself, spent time in a debtor's prison. It is a stark reminder that courage on the battlefield does not automatically translate to success in civilian life. That the skills that make a man extraordinary in war can sometimes leave him poorly equipped for peace. And yet, and this matters, this is not where his story ends in terms of meaning, because what Lee did during his imprisonment, and what he attempted in his later years, was to preserve his own narrative. He wrote, he documented his experiences, he produced memoirs and correspondence that were intended, quite deliberately, to ensure that his version of events would survive. Was this self-serving? Yes. But it was also, in a strange way, an act of defiance. He could not control what happened in his civilian life. He could not undo the financial disasters or the imprisonment, but he could control the story. He could ensure that the tactical decisions he had made, the reasoning behind them, the reasons his operations had succeeded, all of this would be recorded for future consideration. This is a pattern you will see repeatedly in the lives of Revolutionary War commanders who did not achieve the highest national office. They became custodians of their own memory. Some, like Lee, did this through writing, others through correspondence, through spoken accounts recorded by younger men hungry for military knowledge. They understood, perhaps intuitively, that history would be written by those who lived longest and spoke loudest. The broader lesson here is something that the contemporary mythology of Henry Lee often obscures. He was not a figure of unbroken triumph. He was a man of genuine military talent who made correct decisions under pressure, who inspired loyalty, who accomplished difficult objectives, but he was also a man vulnerable to the same uncertainties, the same financial pressures, the same personal limitations that affect all human beings. And this is why his story remains important, particularly for those seeking to understand not just the Revolutionary War, but the nature of command itself. Because command is not simply about tactical brilliance. It is about judgment under uncertainty. It is about maintaining morale when resources are scarce. It is about making decisions that will affect real people, knowing that you will never have complete information, never have certainty, never have the luxury of waiting for perfect conditions. Henry Lee understood this. Every decision he made in the field reflected this understanding. When he held positions with smaller forces, he was not relying on superior numbers. He was relying on positioning, on speed, on the psychological impact of aggressive but calculated maneuvering. He was relying, in short, on thought. If you want to dive much deeper into the tactical decisions that defined Lee's career, the specific choices he made at places like Guilford Courthouse, the logistics behind his cavalry raids, the way he evolved his thinking as the war progressed, our comprehensive guide is available in the description and pinned comment. It walks through each major operation, the intelligence he was working with, and the alternatives he rejected. It's the kind of detailed analysis that you simply cannot fit into a video format. For now, what matters is this. By the time the Revolutionary War ended, Henry Lee had become a known quantity. Officers knew his name. Soldiers volunteered to serve under him. Washington valued his judgment. And in the closing campaigns of the war, when the outcome was no longer in absolute doubt, Lee remained exactly what he had always been: reliable, competent, and focused on the mission at hand rather than personal glory. There were commanders in the Revolutionary War who sought headlines. There were officers who made bold moves designed partly for tactical advantage and partly for the impression they would make in newspapers and historical accounts. Lee was not one of these men. His aggressive tactics served clear military purposes. His cavalry operations were not cavalry for cavalry's sake, but cavalry deployed to achieve specific objectives: gathering intelligence, disrupting supply lines, preventing enemy movement, protecting the main army. This distinction might seem subtle, but it is crucial. It separates the commanders who won battles through genuine insight from those who won battles through a combination of skill and luck, and who spent the rest of their lives insisting that it was mostly skill. Lee's record speaks for itself precisely because he did not feel the need to constantly remind people of his accomplishments, which makes what happened after the war all the more poignant. A man of genuine military achievement, a man who had served his country with honor and competence, found himself in circumstances where none of that mattered. The skills that had earned him respect in war were irrelevant to managing finances in peace. The judgment that had served him well in military matters could not be reliably applied to business decisions, and the network of military officers who had respected him could not help him once he had stepped outside the military sphere. By 1812, when the United States entered into another war, this time against Britain, Henry Lee was in his 50s, in failing health, and no longer in a position to take field command. He had written his memoirs by then. He had documented his campaigns. He had attempted, with whatever influence he retained, to shape the historical record. But he never returned to active duty. The window had closed. The man who had once been indispensable to the Continental Army was now simply a historical figure, a relic of a previous era, remembered by some but increasingly marginalized as new generations of military officers rose to prominence. He died in 1818, relatively obscure, his reputation already beginning to fade into the kind of historical obscurity that would define his legacy for the next 2 centuries. The one-armed officer who had held mountain passes with exhausted farmers, who had commanded cavalry with precision, who had earned the trust of George Washington, he became a footnote. And this brings us back to the question posed at the beginning: why does this story matter? Why should we care about a Revolutionary War commander who did not become a national hero, who ended his life in obscurity and financial ruin? The answer is because his story tells us something essential about command, about service, and about the true nature of military excellence. It tells us that the greatest commanders are not always the ones whose names are famous. Sometimes they are the ones who did their job correctly, who made good decisions when it mattered, and who did not require constant recognition to maintain their sense of purpose. Henry Lee was one of these, a man of genuine competence, a man of real courage, a man whose judgment mattered, whose decisions affected the course of battles, whose presence on a battlefield could change the calculus of what was possible. He was not a legendary figure. He was something perhaps more valuable. He was proof that excellence in command comes not from extraordinary gifts, but from clear thinking, from attention to detail, from the willingness to make the hard decisions that others might avoid. In the end, that is the legacy of Henry Lee. Not the one-armed officer holding a pass against impossible odds, although that moment was real and did happen, but the continuous, unglamorous, essential work of a man who understood that winning wars is a matter of making better decisions than your enemy, day after day, for as long as it takes. That understanding never left him. Even in poverty, even in prison, even in obscurity, Henry Lee remained convinced of the importance of what he had done. And history, slowly and imperfectly, has come to agree. If you want the complete tactical breakdown and the lesser-known details of Lee's campaigns, the intelligence operations, the supply chain decisions, the political maneuvering that allowed him to maintain his position, get the full ebook guide from the description or the pinned comment. It goes far deeper than we can cover here, and if you're serious about understanding Revolutionary War military strategy, it's worth your time. Thank you for watching. This channel exists to make sure that men like Henry Lee, the skilled, the courageous, the overlooked, are remembered the way they deserve to be. If you found this story worth your time, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on those notifications so you never miss a new upload. We have so many more forgotten heroes to uncover.